right, welcome everybody to this conservation roundtable with OceanWise. My name's Jeremy Douglas, and I'm Executive VP for External Relations. And thanks to everyone who's joined back and been part of some of these previous conservation roundtables. Always love to have you part of these. And today we're joined by the amazing Dr. Valeria Vergara, which I love that alliteration of a name. And I'm really excited about what she's going to be talking about, as I'm sure all of you are. But before we jump into that and hear from Valeria, I just want to start by recognizing that I am right now on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. So that is the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, whom we are honored to be able to work and play on their traditional territory. And maybe just to open this up to a little bit of interactivity, please feel free to put in the Q&A where you're joining from. I'd love to hear which traditional territory you're joining in from for this webinar right now. So again, thank you everybody for joining, for your support for OceanWise, whether that be donation, be volunteering, or taking action to help improve the health of our oceans, which is really what we're all about. That's why we exist, is to create healthy oceans and a healthy planet. And before we get into Valeria's presentation, I thought it would just be helpful to refresh everybody's memory, or maybe this is the first time where you're just seeing about what it is that we're trying to accomplish as an organization. We're a charitable organization. We're mission-based and focused on improving the health of the oceans. And we've recently undergone a strategy to determine what we want to accomplish, what we think the big threats and opportunities are for 2030. So we're looking at that horizon. And with that, I'll share something that might be helpful for all of you to see, just to orient yourselves on this. So this infographic is essentially, in a nutshell, what we're focused on with OceanWise. So we're focused on a decade to turn the tide. So 2030, actually this year and starting next week is the official launch of the UN Decade for Ocean Science. So it's the UN's Decade of Action. Top scientists from around the world agree we've got till 2030 to make serious changes to combat climate change and avert the worst impacts of the trajectory there. So we're aligned with that and focused on three main threats to the ocean, which are climate change, ocean pollution, and overfishing. And so in some of these previous webinars, we've talked about some of the initiatives we're doing, for example, in the Arctic Ocean and the Canadians' high Arctic. We talked last time about seafood and conservation, and in a previous one also about plastics and the threat and the impacts of an increasing amount of plastic waste entering our oceans. And today we're going to be talking about whales, which is possibly one of the longest running research initiatives with OceanWise, dating back to the very early days of the Vancouver Aquarium. And always, you know, the whole purpose of working with whales was to better understand how we can help the whales in the wild and recover their populations. And that's exactly what Valeria is focused on. So this is, in a nutshell, this graphic shows what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. And we're excited to be working with all of you, with the private sector, with government, with everybody who wants to help make that possible. So I'll hand over to Valeria now, who has been with OceanWise for a number of years and is a world-renowned expert on underwater noise and understanding communications and how those communications between whales are impacted by human activities and what can be done about that. And so maybe, I don't know if you've been called this before, Valeria, but I was thinking maybe you should be the whale whisperer. Because you can speak whale, I think, and we're going to get to hear some of whale sounds as well. So again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to those in the second half of the webinar and make this as much of a conversation and a dialogue as possible. But I'll hand it over to you now, Valeria. So take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that very wonderful introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I am very excited to be sharing my work with you and excited to hear your questions at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right, so maybe Jeremy, you can go yes with your head if you can see this. Excellent. All right. So first, a little bit about our Whales initiative, which Jeremy summarized very nicely, but essentially it focuses on understanding and mitigating whale unfriendly human behaviors that lead to key stresses that impact our sentinel whale populations and their ocean environments. And the threats are many. Whales have to deal with climate change, with chemical pollution, with plastic litter and ship strikes and fishing gear, with noise pollution. And for the last number of years, really the last 2 decades of my life, I have been studying how these incredibly social, long-lived animals that are beluga whales communicate in an underwater world that is becoming increasingly noisy. And understanding how noise impacts whales is very much related to the study of cetacean communication. What do we mean by noise? Noise is basically an unwanted sound. You have probably all experienced unpleasant sounds at one point or another. You can cover your ears very easily. Whales cannot do that. And there's little doubt that noise pollution is a threat to human well-being and health. We know this. There's article after article in the newspaper that noise interferes with sleep, with concentration, with communication, and that it really has adverse impacts on our health. Imagine having a fire truck in your kitchen, for example. So if for us noise is a problem, for whales that rely on sound for pretty much every aspect of their lives, to communicate, to navigate, to find their way, to find food, to find mates, it can be a very dire problem, and it can sometimes be deadly. Beaked whales and pilot whales and sperm whales have all died from noise-related causes. Military sonar or seismic air guns could be at fault in these cases. Both emit loud pulses of sound for hours and hours on end, which might interfere with their echolocation system or ability to navigate, and it may cause whales to panic to escape the noise and shoot very quickly to the surface, causing decompression sickness, which means it affects the tissues of many organs. Or they can sustain injuries that are blast type injuries. And without going to those very dire extremes, other sources of underwater noise pollution are related to shipping traffic and recreational vessel traffic as well. Water transmits sound much more efficiently than air, and levels of underwater human-generated noise have increased at a staggering rate over the last 60 years or so. And this is one of my favorite videos from the Arctic. How belugas use sounds, how whales use sounds, really, is a crucial aspect of their ecology that we need to understand in order to gain insight into the effects of an increasingly noisy ocean on these very, very sound-centered animals. So this is what I've been doing for the last 2 decades, and along with colleagues, there's a lot that we've learned, and how this connects to our understanding of noise impacts will become clear, hopefully, as the lecture goes on. But we've learned that belugas use contact calls that are necessary between mothers and calves to stay in contact and for group cohesion. And they have been identified in several aquariums, including the Vancouver Aquarium, and in a number of wild populations. And these calls are very broadband. This is a spectrogram for all of those not familiar with acoustics. The way you read a spectrogram is the time axis is the bottom axis, and the y-axis is the frequency in kilohertz. And those dark white bands are the acoustic energy of the call. And so beluga contact calls are very broadband, and sometimes they have a little whistle at the bottom, at the lower frequencies. I'm going to play this for you. If you want to sort of increase the volume of your computers or wherever it is that you're listening to this talk, you might appreciate the sound. So it's easy to identify these sounds, which makes it easy to study them, because instead of sounding like all the whistles and chirps typical of belugas, they sound like chainsaws or like a creaky door, basically. I spent 2 summers in the high Arctic. This yurt was my home office for those 2 summers, studying the calls that wild belugas in a beluga nursery produce. And I'm not going to go over the methods. I'm just going to say that our results suggest that wild belugas may have a system of signature contact calls. This means that each beluga swims around identifying itself with a name of sort, with a sonic name tag. And these signature calls might be just individuals, strictly individual, or shared with very close companions. And this is something that we're investigating in the St. Lawrence. So this again has conservation implications. It's data that we are currently using in the St. Lawrence River estuary. So a little bit about this population. It is geographically and reproductively isolated from other populations, and it has been listed as endangered by the Species at Risk Act in 2016 because of the failure to recover numbers. There's around 900 individuals or so. There's a number of problems affecting this population. There's an increased calf mortality since 2008. We don't know why this is. There's an increased female death associated with problems during parturition since 2010. And high noise levels and basically anthropogenic disturbance or human disturbance have been identified amongst the 3 main threats to the recovery of this population. And it's the same for the southern resident killer whales here on the west coast. So in much of this area, the Saguenay St. Lawrence Seaway, belugas are exposed to noise from both recreational and commercial vessel traffic. And of the portion of the beluga population exposed to commercial marine traffic, the vast majority are females with calves. So given the high level of vessel activity, it's really important to understand the impacts of noise on things like mother-calf acoustic communication. So again, I'm going to ask you to make sure your speakers are quite set at loud so that you can appreciate this. This is a recording I made in 2008 of a very quiet morning. It was around 6 in the morning in the St. Lawrence before all the marine traffic started picking up. And after that, I'm going to play what happened when boats started coming into the area on the same day. So this is the quiet recording. I hope you guys are hearing that. Beautiful beluga whistle. And then here comes the boat noise. And I'm not going to torture you any further with that, but you probably could hear the very faint whistles in the background, belugas attempting to communicate over the boat noise with each other. So that is what we call masking. One of the most important impacts of vessel noise on whale communication is communication masking, or the reduction of the range over which a vocalization or a signal can be detected and decoded by another whale. And the consequences of communication masking can have to do with interfering with important social behaviors and, for example, or group cohesion and coordination, and they can be particularly adverse in the case of critical vocalizations that maintain contact between mothers and their dependent calves. And this is where our understanding of contact calls comes into play. So there's a large number of important pieces of information that we need to understand to look at the reduction in communication space of a call, and all of these things informed our study. So it's a study, the study that we conducted that attempted to understand the impacts of noise on endangered beluga mothers and calves took about 3 years, because of all these different pieces of information we had to put together. So we have to know how loud the vocalizations are. This is at the bottom of the graph where it says source level of the signal. We need to understand the loss of acoustic energy between the animal that vocalizes and the animal that is hearing the vocalizing animal. We need to understand what kind of ambient noise the animals are dealing with, how well they hear, and something that is called the critical bandwidth of the auditory filter, which is a big blurb, which really all it means is that the cochlea in the inner ear, this is for humans as well, decomposes sounds into frequency bands that reflect the size of the auditory filter or the range of frequencies that you'll be sensitive to. And so noise effectively interrupts a signal or masks a signal when it is within this critical bandwidth. And different species have different critical bandwidths. That's all you need to know. So to put all these pieces of information together, one of the things we did is monitored ambient noise in Bay Sainte Marguerite. This is a beautiful area that we had the pleasure to work at for a number of years. A small delta at the confluence of the Saguenay and Sainte Marguerite rivers in the St. Lawrence estuary. And it is an area of high residency for female belugas and their little calves. They use it for socializing, for resting, for caring for the calves. So we gathered visual information from a 6-meter tower where we spent a lot of our days on number and type of boats and approximate distance of the boats to the belugas and the hydrophone. In addition to the presence or absence of belugas in the bay at the time when boats were passing by. We also had eyes above and ears below, and I'll let you listen. That's a contact call that you're hearing now. So essentially, we combined drone technology with hydrophone technology to understand the group composition in relation to the usage of these contact calls that because of our previous work are very easy for us to identify. So great use of 2 technologies combined. So as I mentioned, we also have to take into account beluga hearing, and like other mammals, belugas have a U-shaped audiogram. In this case, the range of best sensitivity is amazingly between 45 and 80 kilohertz. Now, for you to understand what this means, we measure frequency in cycles or vibrations per second, and in frequency is kind of like musical pitch, right? And humans, we have a hearing range up to 20 kilohertz. So imagine what it means when we say that belugas hear to 150 kilohertz. They are animals that have an amazing hearing ability. So we also had to understand how loud these calls were, and so we partnered with scientists from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we looked at the source levels or loudness of wild belugas in the St. Lawrence. We deployed D-tags on 22 individuals, and don't worry, these are very non-intrusive tags. They attach with suction cups to the animal and then fall off a couple of hours later. And so they have 2 little hydrophones within the tags, amazingly. So we analyzed over 93 hours of acoustic data from the tagging events. And we identified contact call series, again, based on our experience, identifying contact calls in spectrograms and acoustically. And then the contact call series produced by the tagged whale were distinguished from those that may have been produced by whales swimming next to the tagged whale by something that we called angle of arrival methodology, which is basically playing with the time delay between the 2 hydrophones and the signals on the 2 hydrophones. So following this methodology, and I won't go over the details, I'll just ask you to trust me that only 4 of these tagged whales produced contact calls that we could absolutely for certain identify to those whales. And those were 53 contact calls that we use for our data on loudness. And we also partnered with folk at Oceanographic Aquarium because there was a little calf that was born there a few years ago, and we wanted to know how loudly calves vocalize, and that is something that's very difficult to do in the wild. So we did it with our oceanographic partners. We looked at 65 calls produced by a newborn calf and his parents at the aquarium. So in a nutshell, this represents the loudness of the calls for adults, for both data sets of adults in the St. Lawrence and at the aquarium. And you can see, the mean of 150, for example, dBs, decibels, is a relative scale to measure loudness, compared to 127 decibels for little calves. And this is a huge difference because the decibel is a logarithmic scale. So it just means that the calls of calves are incredibly soft, particularly during the first few weeks of life. And this is a problem because in the sense that even moderate increases in ambient noise will create a very small communication space for little calves. And you can see there the dark bands of the mother of the calf at that aquarium, and then the very light bands for the 15-day-old Kylo who spoke very, very softly. So what we did, again, I'm trying to summarize this as much as I can and not go all crazy with stats and graphs on you, but what we did for each one of the calls in our sample is that in each frequency band and at each distance, we subtracted the beluga hearing curve or the noise level, whichever was greater, from the received sound level. And this gave us a signal excess, which is the number of decibels that the beluga call is above the noise level or the hearing curve. And so when that number is 0, another whale would not be able to hear the call. And so this is how distances for each frequency were estimated. So if we take a representative call to illustrate the reduction in range in noise, in the absence of boat noise, most frequency bands you can see on the graph that says no boats, between 1 and 10 kilohertz would be audible to another whale between 1 and 3 kilometers away, to a maximum of about 6 kilometers. If you introduce noise, most bands would be inaudible just past 500 meters, or a kilometer and a half, actually, for some of the frequency bands. For neonates, because they produce calls that are so soft, if we use a representative newborn call from day 5 of life, the maximum audible distance in the absence of boats would be 300 meters and less than 150 meters in boat noise. So we did this for a number of iterations, combining every single call in our data set with every single minute of noise recorded from 2017. And we've estimated that the calls would suffer a 59% reduction in range for adults and 53% reduction in range for neonates. And this is, again, a real problem for little calves, because a 53 reduction in communication range means that some calves could not be heard past 60 meters. 60 meters is a very short distance for cetaceans. If there is any kind of disturbance that would make it so that mom and calf inadvertently separate, mom then may not be able to hear the calf. So in conclusion, the maximum communication ranges are 18 times larger for adult calls than newborn calls. And newborn beluga calls are particularly sensitive to increases in noise. And this is just about to be published in the journal Polar Research coming out in March. So we're very excited about this. And now understanding mother-calf communication helps guide mitigation efforts and management of human activities in breeding grounds. I'm going to show you a very cute, what I think is a very cute example, because we were able to provide samples of our contact calls recorded in the St. Lawrence to DFO, who put together this video for the public. So those are the kinds of conservation implications of the kinds of research that we conduct. What can we do? Well, it is very hopeful because we can just simply turn down the noise. So noise is something that we can do something about, and the effects of doing something about it are heard immediately. So we can implement ship quieting technologies. So if 18% of the noisiest ships reduce the noise output, but by just 6 decibels, the area that is insonified would be greatly reduced. We can clean the hulls of boats and polish our propellers to reduce noise. That goes a long way to reducing noise as well. We can incentivize the use of quieter vessels through a port fee system, such as a really great program that the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority actually has, where quieter vessels pay lower port fees. We can set aside quiet sanctuaries with no-go zones for boats. That's super important. We can simply slow down. Slowing down vessels greatly decreases noise, and we understand this through, for example, a great program by the Port of Vancouver, commissioned to understand if slowing down vessels would be effective in reducing underwater noise levels, and there was great voluntary participation by commercial pilots on this program, and most commercial vessel pilots complied, basically. So an excellent example of collaboration, and the speed reductions resulted in reduced noise from all commercial vessel classes and an overall reduction in underwater noise in all nearby habitats. So things can be done. What OceanWise is doing, what we are doing, we of course continue to do research, because to understand the effects of noise, we need to understand how belugas behave acoustically, and also how to improve methods to monitor belugas acoustically. We are monitoring noise in key areas of the St. Lawrence beluga critical habitat. We've been doing that for a number of years. And in BC, we have a new initiative that we're working on also to monitor noise. And in the Arctic, to some extent, we have been monitoring noise, and we hope to do so more emphatically in the future. We also provide science-based advice to put policies and management practices in place to protect whales. And education is key for us, of course. For example, for if you want more information on any of these, take a look at our new Ocean Watch Spotlight report on underwater noise. It just came out this month, And then you can read all about this particular study on beluga whales and about the ECHO Port of Vancouver study and about a couple of other wonderful studies that show how underwater noise pollution negatively affects marine mammals. Thank you very much, and I am looking forward to what I hope are many questions from you. And I'm going to stop sharing screen right now, if that worked.
All right, that is excellent. Thank you so much, Valeria.
Yes, oh, you're very welcome.
So would love to hear questions that folks have, so please feel free to type them into the Q&A and we'll try to get to them. And thanks for those who entered some questions when you're registering, so maybe I'll get to some of those ones first. A couple of people were asking about the impacts of COVID and fewer cruise ships, fewer passenger boat travels. What's the impact been on marine mammals and on whales? Have you been able to observe a noticeable change with quieter waters? Can you comment on that, Valeria?
Sure, yeah. So we know, for example, that in places like the Arctic, there's been a boom in cruise ship tourism in the last few years as the warmer waters of the Arctic become more navigable or become warmer and less icy. So this year, I'm sure it was a reminder for marine mammals, and I wrote about that in a blog, of more quiet times in the area than, you know, these marine mammals being used to really to areas that are a lot quieter than the southern industrial areas. Locally, a really key study that is a really good example of what's going on is that one by David Berkeley. He's a professor at Dalhousie University, and so he took the opportunity to explore how much change occurred in underwater noise levels near the Vancouver Island and also in the Georgia Strait. He partnered with Ocean Networks Canada. They have a great underwater noise observatory. And so what they found is that between January and April, I think, April or May this year, there was a reduction of nearly 2 decibels or 1.5 decibel. And remember, this is a logarithmic scale, so it sounds little, but it isn't. Compared to last year off the west coast of Vancouver Island. And for the Georgia Strait, the reduction was 5 to 6 decibels, so really notable. For us in the St. Lawrence, we had hydrophones in 2 key areas of beluga critical habitat that are frequented by boats this year, and we're going to compare the noise outputs to future years. So it remains to be seen.
I guess that makes sense just intuitively, that if there's fewer boats traveling through and fewer larger vessels, it'll be quieter and then therefore better for communication among marine mammals and whales. But absolutely, even if you discover that, are you worried that it's just going to go back to business as usual, or do you feel like government and others they'll actually use this as an opportunity to learn from what you find out and change the way that they operate?
Well, of course, the optimist in me always wants to believe that, lessons are learned and that change occurs. And so, yeah, here's to driving that change.
All right, well, I'll remain an optimist with you. There's a question that came through about whether orca mothers and calves can also make contact calls. We don't know that. We know a lot about the different dialects and the different calls that different pods have for orca, but we don't have a lot of information specifically on mother-calf communication. It's a great question, and another interesting question is, do orca calves produce the soft, calls that beluga calves produce? It's actually true for humpback whales. There was a great study published on the cryptic sort of soft calls produced by humpback whale calves and how also this may be affected by noise, but we don't know for orca calves. Right, and I guess everybody or a lot of people had seen the good news recently about the calf being born that was discovered in off the coast of Washington State.
Yes.
And so would you, I mean, you probably can't conclusively link this to less noise, but, you know, do you take that as a positive sign that noise does play a really big role on the recovery of that population of the southern residents?
I mean, to make population level conclusions about things like noise is very difficult. I mean, to what extent that pregnancy, that successful pregnancy and delivery would have occurred with regular noise levels, it's a guess. But we can certainly say that whales, both on the west coast and the east coast, are being bombarded by a number of factors, not just noise, but, you know, industrial pollution and especially decreased food availability. And that the more we do to decrease at least some of these factors, the better. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's not so simple as one particular thing. It's the whole sum of all of those.
That's right.
And maybe that relates to this question that we got from Dan, who was asking about, you know, you mentioned or alluded to some of the strandings that had happened and the role that noise might have played on that. Can you say more about like how noise would cause beachings and strandings with whales?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when you think about very loud, scary pulses, that suddenly a whale that is diving very deep hears, and that whale usually takes its time going up to the surface, just like divers do. You know, we do the same. But that whale changes its diving behavior because it panics and it shoots to the surface. So, and these are just theories. We don't know that this is true, but it is the most likely theory that decompression sickness, which is also what happens to human divers if they shoot too quickly to the surface after having been diving deep, occurs. And so this affects tissues and organs. For example, you can have things like bleeding in the inner ear. So that's one of the mechanisms.
Oh, interesting. Another question from Dan. This is an interesting one about whether there are any, I guess you'd call them like sound sanctuaries, where whales or places, whether it's in Canada or internationally, have you seen this where its government has decided, and maybe with industry as well, that needs to be a quiet place for whales because of their populations there? Absolutely.
We need to go towards that, to work towards creating more of these quiet sanctuaries. The problem, and there's always a but, is that noise transmits very, very well underwater, about 4 to 5 times faster than in air. So if you take the example of the Saguenay River, it's a very narrow river, it's 2 kilometers. And so the government set aside a quiet sanctuary. That's where we worked, where we had the tower. One of the reasons we had the tower is actually to not introduce more noise with a research boat. So that area is closed off to any kind of boat activity, including kayakers. Nothing can go in there. But there has to be a way for boats to go from one side of the river to travel up or down the river. So all the boats line up and go on the other shore. The other shore is only 2 kilometers away. So the noise is still deafening, unfortunately. So it's still good news in the sense that the disturbance, the physical disturbance to belugas was greatly reduced, but the noise, you know, we compared recordings from before and after the quiet sanctuary was established, and we didn't find much of a difference in noise levels, unfortunately. So these are things that need to continue to be discussed at the table to see how you know, which locations are truly effective locations for quiet sanctuaries and how big to make them so that they benefit from noise reductions. Yeah, and I mean, that's such a critical point, and some of the other questions coming in now is about, you know, somewhere like Vancouver, which is a highly populated port city where you have the movement of goods and people constantly.
but then you also have this other resident population that's impacted there. And government and industry are not going to say all of a sudden, okay, we're just not going to have boats in the water anymore. So that's not a realistic option. So what hopeful signs do you see in terms of working towards creating the sound environment for those populations in an area where there's still going to be the movement of vessels? I think you mentioned some of those solutions that are promising there, but I mean, how do you balance those two things, I guess, is the question, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, the key here is to work with industry, to work right alongside industry, so that all those technologies that greatly reduce the output noise levels of a ship can be implemented. And so things like not just retrofits, but elevating the engine room from the floor, so that to reduce the amount of vibration, changing the propeller shape so that propeller cavitation decreases. All those things just cost a bit more money. New ships would have to be built, and they are. But if we work with industry, these are all achievable things. So again, to bring the point home that noise is something that we can do something about. We absolutely can work towards lower noise levels. If you think about things like submarines, they've been incredibly stealthy and quiet for decades. So the technology is there. We know how to make things that go on the water quieter than they currently are.
Yeah, good point. Maybe we'll all be traveling in submarines to Vancouver Island sometimes. So just on that point about different vessels, I thought it was fascinating that simply cleaning your propeller can have an impact on the noise output there. In terms of these retrofits and other measures, are government providing enough? Are they providing incentives for boat owners and companies to be able to make those changes so that they can be quieter? I guess, where are the incentives there? You mentioned one good example about the Port of Vancouver.
Yeah.
Having lower fees.
Absolutely. I think we have to have more incentives, and I don't know that they are there yet, unfortunately. But things like having boat manufacturers, for instance, test their boats for noise and advertise the noise level outputs at the point of sale should be a must. We should be able to know how loud a boat is or a ship is before putting it on the water, before purchasing it. So that should be mandatory. There's a lot of regulations that are well, they're not regulations yet. They're suggestions, they're guidelines, and they're very good guidelines, but they need to be made mandatory. So
wonder if you can talk about different boat types, because I think when we talk about some of this traffic, some people immediately think about like the big container ships or those types, but there's of course there's sea-doos, and then there's people's private boats, and smaller, those leisure crafts, and then there's ferries. Can you maybe rank or give us a bit of an understanding of which vessels have what sort of noise profile and impact on the ability for these whales to communicate?
Absolutely. So I won't lie, I don't know that by heart, but fortunately, there's amazing studies out there that talk about exactly that. So if you Google ECHO, the Port of Vancouver study, they measured different the sound levels by different ships. If you go to our report, the Ocean Watch report, you will have a very nice graph that indicates source levels, and I have it in front of me. It's on. Oh, I don't have it in front of me, but it is on the report on page 10, I believe. And it's a nice illustrative graph to indicate how a tanker differs from a container, differs from a passenger a ship, or from a fishing vessel. So that will give you some idea of how radically different the different noise footprints of different boats are. In the St. Lawrence, we were quite impressed when we were on the research tower to hear every time that a skidoo would pass by. The water, little tiny personal crafts, you know, for just 1 or 2 people, they were the loudest. We're not quite sure why. Things like boats that have the propeller a little closer to the surface avoid the long-range sound propagation, and so they can be a little quieter. So to a human ear, because the propeller is closer to the surface, they sound louder to us above the water, but they are actually quieter underneath the surface.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of sea-doos, and you can hear them even when you're on the beaches growing up off of Lake Erie. You know, it'd really be annoying when people are whipping back and forth. So if I can imagine underwater hearing that all the time, you know, as a marine mammal, you know, as well, that could have a huge disturbance there. Someone had submitted an interesting question in advance in relation to, you know, we were talking mostly about industry, like for shipping and leisure crafts and those sorts of things. And what about the Canadian military or other militaries who are doing underwater exercises there? Are they paying attention to this? Are they bound by the same sort of rules around sound?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So they are not bound by any specific speed or noise limits, but they're bound by the general marine mammal regulations under the Fisheries Act. And these regulations prohibit harassment, injury, or killing without a license of marine mammals. And they're bound by the protective measures of SARA, that's the Species at Risk Act, which also prohibit killing, injury, or destroying critical habitat of SARA species. And one of the things that we are doing at OceanWise is we're using the RAST, the Whale Report Alert System, to try to avoid conducting military exercises near where whales are.
Maybe you could say a little bit more about the Whale Report Alert System, because that's something that we've come up with at OceanWise as this solution to how do you create that balance between shipping and the demand for shipping goods and people, and creating an environment where whales can communicate with each other. So did you want to say a little bit more about what that is exactly?
Sure. So it's basically a conservation tool developed for mariners I'm talking mariners of large commercial vessels, to reduce the risk of ship strike and disturbance for cetaceans. So mariners are alerted to the presence of reported whales, of whales that are reported to us, so that they may take appropriate mitigation measures, and alerts are generated from real-time reports that are submitted by citizen scientists via the Whale Report app.
Yeah, I think that's such a great innovation. So for people who, on this call might have logged a whale report in the past. So please do know that those were really important, not only for understanding, different populations and where they are and those sorts of things, but now we've linked that to making sure that those on the water are informed when they're in the vicinity of, killer whale pod, for example, that they can slow down or divert course so that they're not going to have as big of an impact. So please keep logging those reports when you see a marine mammal or when you see a cetacean. Log it on your whale report app and get others to do that, because it is having this real-time impact right now. We had a question here about what happens with belugas in particular, and the mother and calf calls if they do get disrupted or get separated. What are the chances that they're going to be reunited and find each other again?
Yeah, and that is the million-dollar question. It's, we know that little calves are found dead, and we don't know to what extent noise is one of the culprits. We suspect that noise has something to do with at least some of the mortality. Some other calves that are found dead may have to do with the fact that their mothers died of parturition problems. That's another very real possibility. But for a mother and a calf, one of the things that we have to think about is the fact that calves stay very, very close to their moms. So really, how much do they separate? But there's something called drafting, where a mom will swim and the calf will follow and use the sort of the aerodynamic movement of the mother to get propulsed or to draft with the mother. That's called echelon swimming. And if there's a disturbance, so for instance, imagine 3 sea-doos barreling into a beluga herd, and mom gets scared and swims a little bit too fast, the calf will lose the ability to use that mother's kind of a wake to follow along, and they can split. And so what our results show is that if that separation is beyond, say, 100 meters, which is very quick in a marine environment, then we have a problem because there's noise in the area. And so the ability of the mom to hear her calf and reunite decreases. There's a number of other factors we need to think about. It may be quiet at the time when the calf calls, so the reunion might be effective, you know, so that's on the positive side. There's something called alloparental care in belugas, which is these animals are incredibly cooperative and collaborative in the way they raise the young. So if calf loses mom, maybe another beluga will take over temporarily. So there's a lot of factors involved. We cannot say that because of A, then B, that this will always result in the death of the calf. But we can say it is one more danger, and there is the possibility that mother and calf will not be able to get reunited, and the most dire consequence is death. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. Now, looking at populous areas where there's more shipping, and you mentioned the Arctic as because of the impacts of climate change and more shipping going through areas up there and more cruise travel and tourism. Is there a different dynamic at play in the Arctic? Is the soundscape similar to other places? Could you comment on, what are we likely to see happen with the impacts on beluga populations and others there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the impact in the Arctic would be on beluga populations, on narwhal populations. Narwhal are supposed to be a notoriously shy species, very close relative of belugas. Also bowhead whales. And the thing with the Arctic is that these animals have been used to very, very quiet environments, for millennia, for forever. The noise is very recent in the Arctic, much more recent than in other areas. So we also have to contend with the issue of lack of habituation to noise. The Arctic is warming up at nearly 3 times the rate as the rest of the planet. It is quickly losing ice, and so it is opening up to navigation. And some of these areas were previously, as recently as just a few years ago, inaccessible, completely inaccessible, and iced up, and are now navigable. And not just navigable, but amenable to all sorts of other human activities, such as oil and gas exploration, for example. And again, this used to be very, very recently a very pristine environment. So the marine mammals that inhabit the Arctic are not used to these levels of anthropogenic activity and disturbance. So yes, it's a problem.
Yeah, are any marine mammals used to it? You kind of like, by saying that term, used to it, is there any evidence that any populations are adapting where there'd been maybe decades or many years of noise happening? Is there any evidence that they can adapt to that?
That is such a good question, Jeremy, because biologists use the word habituation, and in the context of the St. Lawrence, which has been a very industrialized area for many, many years, we use that word. Well, are they habituated? They must be habituated. Are they really? Or is it simply that these are very traditional animals that need to return to the same area year after year because they don't know any better? Belugas follow the migratory patterns of the animals they grew up with. They get taught these migratory routes. They have what we may term a migratory culture, and they return to the area that they were brought to when they were little, and they in turn bring their own calves later, and they don't have the experience of any other areas that they could visit to feed, to socialize, to calve. So is it habituation, or is it that if your only food source and socializing center is in your kitchen, and the kitchen is riddled by, like I mentioned earlier, by fire trucks, you have no option but to put up with the fire trucks. You need to keep going back to the fridge that is, is in there. So it's a very good point. Yeah. And
I think what we can all understand is the relatability just in those examples, because it's the same situation. It's your ability to communicate with someone depends on the surroundings being quiet, and so we can relate to these animals and relate to how they're talking to each other and communicating. And in the same way that right now, we're having good conversation because it's quiet around here, but if like a dog started barking or a plane flew over, like it would disrupt it. So which is why I think like they're very charismatic, relatable animals, but humans we have technologies even for people who have hearing issues, or where to mitigate the impacts of sound. You've got noise canceling headphones. Are these like completely off the wall ideas, or do you think that there would actually be like technologies that would come into play to help create a better environment for these animals?
I mean, there are already some technologies such as bubble curtains that are barriers between the source of the noise, for example, for seismic exploration and marine mammals. But really, how effective would they be? We certainly cannot give, like that whale with the headphones that I had at the beginning of the talk. We cannot do that with whales. And another thing to think about is that as much as this is relatable, and as much as we can empathize with, the inability to hear each other, you imagine walking down the road and you're having a great conversation with your kid and an ambulance passes by, you completely need to stop talking until the noise goes away. This is even more dire for marine mammals that rely on sound, not on eyesight, for every aspect of their life. So it's a little bit like living in an acoustic smog. And there is a biological term, actually. Acoustic smog is something that biologists refer to when we think about sound on the oceans. It's as if we were attempting to live our daily lives in a thick layer of constant fog, because vision to us is like, the auditory system to cetaceans.
So I think you already mentioned some of these things, but maybe we'll end on sort of the optimistic point, as you like to do. So what are the things that sort of give you hope, or you're feeling optimistic or positive about with regards to changes that can happen to improve communication for whales?
Well, I think industry is coming on board. The Port of Vancouver's ECHO program is a classic example. They've gone a long ways towards helping us understand not just how different processes that we put in place can reduce noise, how well that does it, such as the slowdowns, but also implementing systems at the port that incentivize quieter vessels. And I think these things are starting to happen in other areas of the world. Noise is, I think, something that people can, again, empathize with. And because solutions are achievable, that is, that's something that the industry is working towards.
Yeah, that's definitely hopeful to see. I would agree completely. Is that industry and government are realizing this is something they need to tackle, and they're not shying away from it. They're not denying it. Right. It exists, and they're looking for solutions. So that's a good note to end on. And thank you so much, Valeria. This is fascinating, and I love hearing those calls and the sounds as well. That's awesome. So thank you everyone for joining in today, and feel free to get in touch if you've got other questions, and hopefully you'll be able to tune into our next webinar. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thanks everyone for your support, and thank you, Valeria.
Thank you very much for having me. A pleasure.
Take care. Bye.